Ancient things and powerful things. Mostly evil, though evil almost feels too small for what they are. Evil's a man with a knife in the alley. Evil is a king starving his own people. But these things that I'm talking about today come from past the guardrails of reality. Cults worship them. Whole civilizations rot from the inside under their shadow. And when these things stir, it's not because they want gold, land, or worship in any traditional normal sense. It's because they want the end. The end of kingdoms, the end of flesh, the end of creation itself. Alright, let's get into it. Today we're talking about one of the most grotesque and terrifying entities in D&D lore, and that's Kyuss, the worm who walks. Not quite mortal, not quite a god, something worse. A man who reached for divinity, paid for it in blood, and became a living prophecy of rot, decay, and crawling green corruption. His followers don't just want conquest, they want to usher in the final age of the world, the age of worms. Now, one thing about Kyuss is that his story doesn't come to us very cleanly. But still, if we strip away all the contradictions, a life takes shape. In this video, I'll be talking about Kyuss in all his forms: the man, the exile, the prophet, the god king and the failed god, and then finally Kyuss as something worse than life, an infection. Let's start with Kyuss the man. Kyuss was once mortal, or at least that's what most scholars believe. His true story is buried under myth. Some say he was a powerful necromancer. Others think he served Orcus, the demon lord of undead. Later stories connect him to gods of death and betrayal, and some even place him inside the church itself, rising through its ranks by manipulation, alliances of convenience, and betrayal. But whichever version you believe, the shape of the man remains the same. Kyuss wasn't just a spooky graveyard warlock or wizard. He was the kind of disciple who looked up at the altar and believed he should be the one standing on it. And that's Kyuss in summary. He despised limits. Mortality was a limit. Flesh was a limit. The gods themselves were a limit. Even yourself, the body, was a limit. Across almost every version of his story, one thing remains the same. Kyuss was evil before he ever transformed into his monstrous form. See, Kyuss lived in an ancient age, long before the oldest modern kingdoms, where humanity had not yet learned to be ashamed of its blasphemies. People openly served dark gods, and even then, Kyuss was considered too extreme. And that should tell you a lot about him. Before the worms try to imagine him, not as the 30-foot mass of crawling filth he would become. Not yet. Let's imagine a man in temple robes, a scholar with dead eyes, maybe as a warlock or a priest who understands doctrine the way your butcher understands anatomy. He was probably brilliant, which is the frustrating thing about monsters like him. They usually are. They see patterns others miss, they understand fear, they know where people are vulnerable. They make cruelty sound like it's destiny. And Kyuss had a doctrine. He preached the age of worms as revelation. He spoke of the age of worms not as an apocalypse, but as liberation. Flesh was a weakness, identity was a lie. Death was not the end, but a door to something greater. In his visions, the worms would strip away the illusion of separate lives and unite all things in one eternal, crawling existence. To his followers, he would not promise survival from the end of the world. He would promise that they could become a part of it. Now, eventually, Kyuss was exiled for his forbidden practices and his obsession with the end-time prophecy he was preaching. His early followers cast him out, likely thinking they had rid themselves of a dangerous, worm-obsessed madman. That was their first mistake. Kyuss as the God King. Kyuss didn't fade into exile. He became a traveling prophet, gathering the frightened, the desperate, and the power-hungry with his sermons about the age of worms. He promised salvation from the coming apocalypse, but like most cult leaders who promise salvation, what he truly wanted was ownership of their bodies, of their flesh, of their faith, and of their deaths. So eventually he led his followers into the jungle, where they found the ruins of Kuluth-Mar, an ancient city, fallen stone, strange writings, and sacrificial history. Kyuss didn't see a warning here, though. He saw a throne. His followers rebuilt Kuluth-Mar, and Kyuss ruled them as a god king, like a necromantic pharaoh on the bones of a forgotten empire. With him in power, the city became a temple, a prison, a laboratory, and lastly, became a slaughterhouse. It was in the laboratories in Kuluth-Mar where he perfected the horror that would become his signature, the spawns of Kyuss. From a distance, these spawns might look like ordinary zombies, but up close, the truth crawls. Their bodies are riddled with worms that animate the corpse, feed on it, and spread. If one reaches a living victim, it burrows into the brain, infects the host, and turns the body into another spawn of Kyuss. And that's Kyuss's vision. Not the undeath, but a replacement. Not a plague, but a sermon that crawls. Now, with the blood of his followers on his hands, Kyuss stood before the Spire of Long Shadows and began to speak in demonic tongues. The words were not a prayer, they were a command. In that moment, he both gained and lost divinity. His body fused with the obelisk, his essence merged with the power of the spire. He was no longer mortal, but he hadn't become a god either. He was something trapped between those states, between life and undeath, between man and deity. Kyuss reached for godhood, and it turns out he found a prison. The man who despised limits became trapped inside one, bound within the very power he had tried to claim. It was from that failed ascension that the thing called the worm that walks was born. But imprisonment didn't end Kyuss, it only changed the way he existed. He could no longer move through the world as a prophet, king, or god, so he became something more discreet, quiet, and much harder to kill. Kyuss as the infection. This is the fifth life of Kyuss, influence from imprisonment. His followers still exist, of course. Some worship him out of fear. Others believe that the age of worms is inevitable. To worship Kyuss is to accept the undeath. Your body becomes a vessel for worms, and your flesh turns into temporary housing. This is where things really change for Kyuss. Over time, he became more than a monster. He became a curse, or like a prophecy, a warning whispered to young warlocks and wizards. Psst, hey, see what happens when you want and reach for too much? You're going to end up just like Kyuss. And it was with this transition that he became something even more useful for Dungeons & Dragons, an entire campaign engine. See, that's what makes Kyuss so effective. He's not just a final boss waiting in a room. He's a system, a contamination, a plague, a rumor, a campaign's North Star, pulling every strange death, old ruin, and whispered secret towards the same cosmic direction. His presence can be felt long before anyone even knows his name. His most famous role comes from the Age of Worms adventure, originally published across Dungeon Magazine in issues 124 through 135. It's widely regarded as one of the magazine's best campaigns. It was a full D&D 3.5 adventure path taking characters from level 1 up to 20. But unlike the big hardcover campaigns we're used to today, the Age of Worms unfolded issue by issue, letting dungeon masters and players discover it one piece at a time. There's something beautiful about that. Old-fashioned, sure, but cool. Players and dungeon masters waiting for the next issue to show up in the mail or on a bookstore shelf, not quite knowing where the story was going next. Everyone would be staring into the dark together, and it was full of worms. In the campaign story, Kyuss' prison becomes linked to Dragotha, a powerful red dragon and former consort of Tiamat. Even trapped, Kyuss was never helpless. His prison became a relic, his whispers became bait, and eventually, one of the most dangerous creatures in the world listened. Dragotha, fearing Tiamat and seeking protection, learned of the necrotic power of the Spire of Long Shadows, so he tore the monolith from the ground and traveled with it north to his lair. There, Kyuss whispered to him from within the stone, "Release me, and you shall live forever." And that kind of promise should always be handled carefully, especially when it comes from an undead worm prophet trapped in a monolith. But dragons aren't famous for humility, so Dragotha performed the ritual and freed Kyuss. Soon after, Tiamat caught up with Dragotha and eventually killed him. But Kyuss kept his promise. He raised the dragon from the dead as a powerful Dracolich, fusing part of his own essence with the dragon's bones. With Dragotha as his new undead champion, Kyuss finally began preparing the Age of Worms he had preached across lifetimes. Dragotha's lair now became known as the Wormcrawl Fissure, and the land around it began to crawl with horrors. The spawn of Kyuss spread through the region, worms, undead, aberrations, and cultists all gathered. It was then that a group of druids, following their own destiny, managed to distract Dragotha with the one thing he still feared, the possibility that he could actually die. While he was preoccupied, they pushed Kyuss back into the Wormcrawl Fissure and bound him once more within the giant monolith. Unfortunately, too few druids survived the battle to preserve their culture, and within a few centuries, they faded from history. Kyuss faded with them, and from the memory of most of the world. But Dragotha endured. He retreated to the cold north and began rebuilding a network of agents, cultists, and hidden service who might one day free Kyuss again. That's the interesting thing about Kyuss. His story doesn't end at death. It doesn't even end at imprisonment. It becomes environmental, cultural, infectious. Most villains begin as a person or with a single evil act, but Kyuss can appear as anything because Kyuss begins as symptoms. A worm in a corpse, a cult symbol carved into an old ruin, or village where the dead don't stay dead. And that's kind of where the Age of Worms adventure path begins. The players don't start out knowing the full story. It's not like anybody walks into a tavern and hears, "Hey, go stop that giant worm from ending the world." It begins with local mysteries, strange death, old ruins, and people who know too much disappearing before they can explain anything. By the time the players understand what the Age of Worms is, it already feels like they're too late. And that's what makes the whole thing work. Kyuss is trapped, sure, but he's everywhere. He's everything. Later in 4th edition D&D lore, he becomes even stranger, classified as an elder evil and tied to strange constellations. Less a villain waiting in a specific place in the world, and more force pressing against reality from the outside, more cosmic and more abstract. The worm that walks is not just a monster. He's a vast being between life and death. In that sense, Kyuss almost feels like a great old one patron, filtered through cosmic horror made from worms and the dark arts. And that's Kyuss, a man who hated mortality so much that he turned himself into a disease and then called the infection destiny. The worm that walks, the failed god, the prisoner in the spire, the prophet of the final age. He's the creator of a plague that doesn't just kill the world, it wears it afterward. See, the real most important question isn't whether Kyuss can return. It's how long the world has before people notice the ground is already moving.